I'm Indy Neidell.
And I'm Spartacus Olsson.
And this is another one of our exciting fireside chats, this time in front of a fire.
Which is an improvement.
Oh, wait, and there's another guy.
And I'm Sebastian. I'm here to ask the questions.
And as usual, we're not really certain what the questions are going to be about, though based on the last ones we've recorded, I'm guessing something that happened either the very end of 1940 or the first half of 1941. Okay?
Today, we'll talk about Yugoslavia, Crete, and Greece.
All right, so shoot the first question, and we'll see how we go.
Could you, both of you, explain the dynamics of the Yugoslav coup in early March? Or it's not early March, but in March 1941. Was it it seems to have been mainly Serbian components within the kingdom that, performed the coup?
The coup was very blue-eyed and very unfortunately timed. It was because Prince Regent Paul, finally, under pressure from Hitler, because they wanted to use the Yugoslavian railways to attack Greece, which would made everything convenient for the German army, finally, under pressure, signed Yugoslavia joining the Axis power, signed the Tripartite Pact. And the coup was against that. And he accepted it, and he went into exile and stuff. Yes, it was mostly Serbs who did that. You know why? It was to preserve Yugoslavian autonomy and not hitch your wagon to Germany. Now, the question isn't about that. The question is about the dynamics.
One has to understand that the dynamics of the Yugoslavia coup really depends a lot on the history of Yugoslavia at this point, which is a very brief history because Yugoslavia is only hardly 20 years old.
Yeah.
And it really hasn't come together in any way. So there are a lot of forces pulling the country apart. And to have yet another external force coming into it kind of adds nitrogen to the dynamite, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, and there was, of course, the Serbs had dominated the national political landscape since its formation, and the Slovenes, the Croats, many of them, Croats wanted their own, a lot of them wanted their own state. And, they, of course, ended up having the puppet regime set up under the Nazi dominance. And when I say blue-eyed, I mean because there was exactly zero foreign countries that say we support the coup. None of the Allied nations said that. None of the Axis nations said that. And you also have to realize that since Paul signed the Tripartite Pact and he signed it through legal means as the legitimate government, it really is an illegal coup. And it would be hard for even a sympathetic country to support that.
As you said, it's within his rights to do that. It was constitutionally protected. But there's another issue at play here, and that is that we're talking about a very difficult situation for Yugoslavia at this point.
Yeah.
They're stuck right between Greece, Germany, Hungary. They are in the middle of countries that are either at war with the Axis or are part of the Axis. So what are they going to do? So what are the Allies going to do? What is Great Britain going to do in order to help a country that is far away from where they are?
There's no way you could get any support to them. It seemed, when I say it was a blue-eyed coup, because the people that did it, how could they not think that this was going to piss off Hitler? And what happens when, we're talking March 1941. Look at 1940. The Germans took over France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway. Why would Hitler say, oh gosh, well, you didn't know, I guess it doesn't count now since it's a new government and you're not part of the pact?
What was the immediate consequence of the coup? What happened?
The immediate consequence of the coup was that Hitler said, fine, I'm going to invade. No, he said, I'm going to destroy Yugoslavia. That was the immediate consequence. And then, the invasion and destruction of Yugoslavia took 6 days.
I think one shouldn't underestimate the internal consequences as well, because this really opened the path for the Croats to form the NDH, the independent Croat state, which was already happening during the invasion of Yugoslavia by the Germans. There were officers in the Croat officers in the Yugoslav army who were defecting to the Germans and fighting on the German side.
Von Ribbentrop had been in touch with Croatians to I mean, promising them their independence after the, a Croatian state, a puppet state, whatever.
So beyond the fact that Germany went in and crushed Yugoslavia, it was also the end of Yugoslavia at this point, at least.
Yeah.
Because it meant that the forces that were striving for independence for their ethnic group in their region got a free path towards that independence, specifically the Croats.
Those elements that were sympathetic toward the German side or the Axis
It's not so
powers?
much sympathetic towards, Nazism. It's sympathetic. I mean, this was for... Sure, there's plenty of people in any country in Europe that were sympathetic towards the Nazis, but this was sympathetic to using that as a means to their own ends.
Yeah, I would say that the Ustasha were pretty
Ustasha was obviously
sympathetic to the Nazis.
And they were brutal, but that's not all Croats.
Still, but
there's also this, Yugoslavia itself was quite shaky at the time. Had there been no Second World War at all, there's no guarantee it would have even survived past 1941 as it was. And as we see, of course, at the end of the war, a completely different Yugoslavia emerges.
In those groups that sympathize with, affiliate with, or are on the side of the Axis, how big is anti-communism a motivation for them?
Well, that gets bigger. I mean, once the communist partisans become a really big thing, then you have like a lot of different groups. You have Chetniks that are anti-communist. You have people that are anti-Nazi and anti-communist, or anti-communist, or anti-Nazi, or anti-Slav, or anti-Ustav. You've got Serb, Slovene, Croat, all have their resistance and all have their organizations like the Chetniks and the partisans and stuff. That gets really complicated.
So it's a mess.
And it becomes very much a case of my enemy's enemy is my friend. You see that especially with the Chetniks under Mihailovic, who kind of gyrate from one side to the other, back and forth throughout the whole war.
Because obviously they're anti-Nazi from the beginning because they just lost their country.
Yeah.
But then they're anti-communist. But the Nazis are anti-communist.
Okay. Yeah, I see it's a very complicated... We could probably talk about this for hours and hours and hours.
You can talk about any year in Yugoslavian or Balkan history for hours and hours and hours.
It's very true. Yeah. There's one last thing. If it's a hypothetical, I know you love those. Let's call it an alternative scenario, right?
Yeah.
If the coup hadn't happened, or if it had been accepted that Yugoslavia now join the Axis, would that have prevented the widespread destruction and casualties, or would have just postponed it to a later date?
Yugoslavia would have been an Axis power. And, well, what happened to the other Axis powers later on in the war?
No.
I mean, obviously, Yugoslavian troops would have been sent to fight on the Eastern Front, sure. Old Yugoslavian formations like the Hungarians and stuff. And there may have been, in 1945, a Nazi invasion of Yugoslavia to stop the Soviets or to stop them trying to take their own freedom, much like what we saw in Hungary. You know? And it would have had the stigma... Yugoslavia would have had the stigma at the end of the war for being Nazi collaborators. So who can say in the long run what's better or worse? There certainly would not have been a Tito government at the end of the war. But
well, I mean, as you noted, we, and I'm speaking for both of us, don't like hypotheticals because of this very thing that I'm about to say now. There are 1,000 different ways that this can play out, but what Indy just said, there wouldn't have been a communist government in Yugoslavia. Are we sure of that?
No, we're not sure of that, of course.
Because Tito's partisans was the biggest resistance movement in the whole war. They counted 500,000 men and women.
But it likely would have been more a Russian satellite, as what happened to Romania and Bulgaria, because the fighting the Germans out of Yugoslavia, a large part of that was done by the partisans and not done by the Soviets. They're like, okay, fine, you guys take care of this. We'll be coming up through, deal with Romania and everything like that.
So anything that ends up differently presupposes the fact that Tito does not raise the partisan army. And that is not a given. Even if the coup doesn't happen, there's a great chance that Tito raises the partisan army and fights the civil war while he's fighting a war against the rest of the Axis. That scenario is there. And if you look at how Fall Weiß and Fall Schwarz went when the Germans tried to eradicate the partisans in 42, that didn't go so well because it's really, really difficult to fight against a partisan army in general. And it's extra difficult if you're fighting in mountainous terrains where you don't have freedom of movement, and they do have freedom of movement because they're not hampered down by logistics and all of that.
It's interesting that you should say that, because if there are certain inherent advantages to the terrain in the region for a defender, maybe it's a partisan force. But in any case, what I wanted to get to is, why did the Yugoslav army surrender so quickly?
Let's get to that in a second. I wanted to add one more thing to that last thing.
Of course.
It's something we also have to think of post-war. Unlike the other Eastern European communist states, which were Soviet satellites, Yugoslavia was not. Well, during the Greek Civil War, because Tito would not bend to Stalin. He listened to him, but he did what he wanted. This might not have happened had the Soviets gone through. Was actually probably because it's a counterfactual, wouldn't have happened had the Soviets gone through Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia was it emerged very separate from the rest of the Eastern European states.
Yes,
that might well not have happened.
And also the only one with a standing army as the war ends, a standing communist army, which none of the other ones had. So in Poland, to take over Poland, Stalin had to move his cronies in there and actually have them create the groundwork or do the groundwork to create the People's Republic. And it goes through all of them. And in Yugoslavia, that was not possible because the Red Army would have had to fight Tito's partisans.
Which, as you already said, number 500,000.
And have a lot of experience.
Yes, fighting the Germans for 4 years.
On their own territory.
Battle-hardened and extremely good at also setting up government. I mean, we shouldn't forget that in the middle of all of this happens later on, but they set up their own republic in the middle of the so it's such a different situation compared to the rest of Europe that a counterfactual is almost not a counterfactual, because what happened there doesn't have so much to do with the coup, doesn't have so much to do with what Germany did, doesn't have so much to do with what the Soviet Union did. It's got everything to do with what the Croats, the Serbs, the Slovenes, and the Bosnians and the Albanians did. That's what it's a war within a war.
And then there are probably a lot of reasons, but what are some of the reasons that led to the quick collapse of the Yugoslav army?
Well, the biggest one was the catastrophically bad deployment of the Yugoslav forces, which some sources have referred to as suicidal, and they're being polite. Basically, the plan was to put the Yugoslavian forces around the entire border with no reserves. So if you break in at any point, you're in. At any point, you're in. Okay? There's the overwhelming German armor and aerial power, which they did not hesitate to use. There's also, as we said, that Joachim von Ribbentrop had spoken to Croatian officers and said, hey, maybe you can defect or not do this and stuff. But if you have to pick one thing, it is the catastrophically bad deployment of the Yugoslav army.
I think another thing that we shouldn't underestimate is what we've been talking about a lot now, and that is the lack of unity. The differing interests that all of the groups in Yugoslavia have at this point. I think, except for the Ustaše, most agree with that they want to defeat the German invasion. But what is supposed to come after that?
Yeah.
Is it supposed to be then a Serb-dominated Yugoslavia? Is it supposed to be a Croat-dominated Yugoslavia? Is it supposed to be a multi-ethnic state?
No, obviously Slovenian-dominated Yugoslavia. I mean, that's what we're all fighting for, right?
So what that does is that since the ultimate goal is different, the path towards that goal is also going to be different. And that means that one partisan in that direction and a partisan in this direction is not going to be very well synced, because they're looking for a different outcome.
They want different things.
And that it comes back to what I said earlier. It's almost like a war within a war, and a war that happens separately from everything the Germans, the Italians, the Russians.
It is a completely different story, the war in Yugoslavia from the rest of.
And one that is extremely difficult to penetrate. It's a little bit like China or.
In terms of sources.
In terms of sources, because since it becomes a communist state and because the war is so destructive inside of Yugoslavia, it leads to a rewriting of history right afterwards, and we don't have any original documents to go back to. So you have to read, you have to try to fight your way through the propaganda. I mean, I remember when I was doing Fall Weiß and Fall Schwarz, I actually could only rely on Serbo-Croatian sources. So luckily enough, we had Ian there at that time who speaks Serbo-Croatian, and he helped me translate. This was before you had AI that could do it for you very quickly. You could upload a PDF. This is how fast things are developing. So I had to do that, and then on top of it, you look at the maps and you find exactly what you find in China. 3 different versions of the same battle. You're like,
they don't even agree on who won the battle.
Did they really move in that direction, or you read it and at first you go like, no, but wait a minute, that's not possible, because if that should happen, then they must have traveled 150 kilometers in less than 3 hours. Okay, that doesn't work. Okay, I got to go back and see what happened.
So, okay, now let's switch theater a bit. We're not drastically changing location, but we just talked about the bad source situation and the reasons for the lackluster performance of the Yugoslav army. As Indy said, it's a disastrous defense plan. What I wanted to ask you is, how come the Greek army performs so much better against the Italians at first? What are some of the differences that...
Well, they didn't have a disastrous defense plan. I mean, they were set up in the Pindus Mountains. They had strong morale. They had great defensive terrain. The Italians, as we talked about before, couldn't send nearly enough force over. They needed a lot more divisions in order to have any chance of really breaking through. It took 4 days to stop the advance. But, I mean, the Greeks also performed better against the German invasion when the Germans came too, against the same enemy.
Metaxas line.
But you also have to remember. I mean, the Germans, the Greeks had backing. The Greeks had a bunch of British stuff too.
They had New Zealand forces fighting at Thermopylae.
They didn't. Just like the New Zealanders did back in the ancient BC days.
Against the British.
Exactly. Yeah.
They were there at Thermopylae, at Salamis. It was the New Zealanders.
Marathon.
Xerxes hated the Kiwis. He said that. Xerxes, he called them Kiwis. He hated it. Xerxes, boy, the Persians were really...
Those Maori fighters, huh?
Yeah, man. They were great back at Thermopylae. And again, in 1941. No, but the Greek army was experienced, well-provisioned, well-deployed. Well, having said that, their deployment ended up coming back to cost them, because their forward troops in the Pindus, they were completely out of position once the German troops who came in from Bulgaria broke through.
One should not underestimate how battle-hardened the Greek were.
Yeah.
The Greek army had just recently fought a terrible war, the Greco-Turkish War, which on both sides wasn't fought very nicely. So they came out of a foreign campaign, more or less, although they didn't necessarily see it as a foreign campaign. That's a whole other story.
Be nice in the comments, again.
Yeah, please. So they had experience, and also...
experience, morale, deployment, equipment. They had all those advantages over Yugoslavia.
What about the forts on the Bulgarian border, the Metaxas line? Does that...
Well, it definitely played into it, but that played into the whole organization of the Greek army. It's easy to say, a line is only a line as long as it's manned. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of buildings. And so it really comes down to their organization. This was a very well-organized defense line with good communication, good logistics behind it, and that's what enabled them to do it. But I think there's another component as well. And that's the choice to actually help, to fight the Italians in Albania as well.
Okay, we'll carry on with that, and then I have something else to point out.
Because at the end of the day, they did what the Yugoslavs were trying to do, which is fight fast, but they did it in a way that enabled them to pull back instead of setting themselves up for a breakthrough, right? So they had a path, they had a retreat path that was possible for them to defend.
So you're saying they didn't just put all troops on the border and no reserves?
No, they didn't.
They didn't.
And
Sounds
also,
like a bad idea.
Remember, the invasion of Yugoslavia was, that happened just after the coup. It wasn't planned for, because joining the Axis powers meant that Germany could have used their railroads and stuff. And the Greeks knew that this was probably coming. The Yugoslavians didn't. Once German troops began massing in Bulgaria in February, by March, the Greeks knew that there were German troops massing in Bulgaria. What other possible reason did they have for massing in Bulgaria? So.
Do you think, now talking about, I want to go into Ioannis Metaxas a little bit.
Metaxas, okay.
And specifically because it's a nice segue to what you just said, Indy, is because he did not want to provoke Nazi Germany. Metaxas acknowledged that he reckoned his army could take the Italians, but that they had no chance against the Germans. Okay. Do you think was there a point where it seemed like Hitler might just let Mussolini, deal with the Greek disaster on his lonesome?
No, it was within a week of the invasion, Hitler had decided he was going to. There was no point to that he had said, okay, it's all on you.
It would have been a huge problem. You have to remember that the German defense plans against an Allied invasion were very much focused on the Balkan route because, it has some historical...
Churchill thought it was a lot.
It has some historical precedence because, as Indy so often has pointed out, at surrender in 1918, the Western Front was still standing, but the Southern
the first
Front...
breakthrough was the Five-Nation Army.
Right? And marching through Austria towards Germany at that point, or through Bulgaria, Hungary, and Germany, were about 2 million men that would have invaded through an undefended border. The Germans knew this, although it's not part of the mythology of how World War I ended. But with that knowledge, the Wehrmacht were very, very, very aware of the weakness that the southern border...
And everyone knew that they were dependent on the oil from the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. An attack through Greece, Bulgaria, that's not that far, So
not helping the Italians in Greece would have meant providing the Allies with a possible staging ground for an invasion going north and then east and west, and cutting off both the oil supply and potentially even getting into Germany.
Now Metaxas was well aware of this as well. That's why when the British were offering troops and help, he did not give them bases for long-range planes that could reach the oil fields because he did not want to piss off Germany because he was still hoping to spare Greece from being attacked by the Germans.
Yeah,
which unfortunately didn't work out.
Yeah, he was wrong.
That's true.
But what is Metaxaism, or what kind of leader is he? Because sometimes it's a bit difficult to categorize.
It's different from regular old fascism, and it's certainly different from Nazi. Well, this is your thing. So.
Yeah, this is a very, very complicated issue. At the end of the day, he was an authoritarian. If you want to call
he called himself totalitarian, but it wasn't.
He wasn't really, though, but he was an authoritarian. He believed in strongman rule and rule by force and all of that.
But authority through the monarchy and the Greek Orthodox Church, kind of like Franco's Spain or Salazar's Portugal. Like corporatism.
A little bit like that, yeah. I mean,
but corporatist, like the Nazis were corporatists.
Yeah, or the Italians were corporatists as well. Yeah, so you could say that he has many facets of fascism within his ideology, but it really goes back to something else. What you shouldn't forget when you're talking about Greece at this time is that this is only 111 years. 112 years after Greece successfully separates from the Ottoman Empire during the War of Independence, which starts in 21, and they become the first nation state in Europe.
First modern nation.
In 1830.
Yeah, well,
before I want to preempt comments again.
Yeah, but before that, they weren't nation states. There were many nations, but
let's not open that right now.
Oh God, I don't want to go there.
Yeah,
but it is important though, because what that means is that a modern Greek national identity emerges early in Greece compared to the other places. It's the 1860s for Italy, for instance. It's the 1850s for Germany. So already a decade before all of the other countries are starting to move towards a modern concept of national identity, Greece has it. Not only that, it becomes a popular movement as well. The Pan-Hellenic movement among the Orthodox Christian Greek population becomes very popular. In most countries, national identity only becomes popular after World War I.
Yeah.
So we're almost 100 years ahead of the rest of Europe when it comes to a popular nationalist movement. So Metaxas, although very similar to other fascist leaders, has a different situation because he's sitting on a tradition that goes back so much further and has so much more popular support than so many other leaders across Europe at this point.
It also didn't have the anti-Semitism, and it didn't have like the imperial expansionistic drive.
The Pan-Hellenic issue had been settled in 23 in the Greco-Turkish War, right? Yeah. So with that settled, at least to for all practical purposes, because of the ethnic cleansing that happened in 23 when 3 million people were moved back and forth. So this is the difference. We have an established nationalist movement that is 100 years old, not like in the other countries where it's 20, 30, or 40 years old. And that makes a difference.
Okay. Moving on to the last sort of topic we're going to be talking about today, which is Crete.
Okay.
Both of you just said that one reason Germany would never have ignored Greece is access to the oil fields, a potential landing spot or base for Allied forces to attack from, and possibly, I suspect, also control of the Mediterranean. And what I was trying to get at is it's probably the same case with Crete, right?
Right.
Well,
no, but as in
not quite the same though.
No, but the Germans cannot let it be.
That's not so much. I mean, once Greece fell, that meant 3 times in a year. 3 times in a year, the Allies, the British actually were involved all 3 times, had been thrown off the European continent. There was nowhere for them to get a toehold again, unless they made a deal with Spain or something like that. Germany wasn't worried about that. Was not worried about that happening. Well, certainly wasn't worried about them beefing up Crete and then suddenly attacking Greece and trying to take over Greece. That would have taken a long time and a lot of resources to build up. And they'd already beaten the British 3 times.
I think it's less about like a staging ground for any invasion or anything like that. It's got more to do with logistics towards Africa.
Yeah. By this time in 1940, they realized that they're going to have to help out. 1941. They realized they've sent Rommel down. They've sent an African Corps down. They realized they have to help out in North Africa, and that is a big deal. And to be able to threaten Alexandria, to be able to threaten Egypt, of course, you cannot rule out that Student had Hitler's ear, and he really, really, really wanted to do a big a big airdrop, a big airborne thing, and show the world what, like at Eben Email in
good old Kurt.
He wanted to do it again. He wanted to wow the world with the amazing airborne skills.
That's nice that you say
German
that.
Paratroops.
It's very nice that you say that.
Yeah, because he failed.
Yeah, and was it particularly poorly planned, or was it badly executed, or what were the reasons?
If you're going to do a daytime airborne drop, one thing you really, really don't want, whatever your plans are, however many people, whatever direction, whatever uniformed equipment they're coming in, you really don't want the enemy to know that you're going to do it. And of course, Allied intelligence, British intelligence, they knew it was coming.
What was it called? Ultra?
Ultra.
Cool name.
Ultra intelligence. Yeah.
There's another thing as well, and that is that any parachute drop is going to be chaotic. And this was the first time that a big, huge parachute drop was made. And
they've done the smaller scale one with fantastic success during the invasion of the Netherlands.
And when they went and in Belgium as well, where they dropped behind the lines and all of that work. So the experience that the Germans have at this point are limited local airdrops
that wow the world.
Yeah, and now they want to do, or Student wants to do, a big one, right? And Crete is big, right? It's also very, very hilly.
Yes, and it's not the best terrain.
The terrain's terrible.
So now comes into play, which will, for the Allies, spoilers, be a big issue on the 6th of June, 1944. That is that winds take people to places. Planes don't fly the way that you expected them to. The enemy
Drops
is in
come
your
early,
way.
drops come late.
Yeah. So this chaos was.
This was Hitler said no more after this.
Really, there's only one way to solve this, and that is, again, I'm spoiling going forward to 1944. It's with mass. You're going to have to drop so many soldiers in that it doesn't matter that they get scattered. And then you have to develop a strategy for how they're supposed to fight, which is more like guerrilla warfare than actual normal battlefield motions.
This wasn't planned.
Which around the same time, right? The British are starting to pioneer with the SAS.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far. I would say that it's actually what Student did was to teach the Allies a lesson.
How to not do it.
I mean, half of the casualties the Germans took in the whole Crete campaign, they took the first day. And there were some big surprises to them. First of all, they didn't think the locals were going to rise up against them, which they did. They didn't bring a lot of water because they're parachuting in and you don't want to carry a lot of heavy stuff. So you have to go to the wells, and the locals would lay ambushes for them and kill the German soldiers by the wells. However, it could have and perhaps should have been a lot worse had it not been for Freiburg refusing to believe the intelligence and saying, oh no, they're coming by sea, which is okay, I guess. I mean, you should believe your intelligence, but okay, a healthy dose of skepticism, fine. But also refusing to change that belief in the irrefutable face of them coming from the sky. Even after 2 days, he still thought, no, this is just a preview. They're going to come by sea. He didn't even defend at Malem airfield.
But the way the Cretans dealt with the whole situation led to some really tragic consequences as well. So the German paratroopers actually performed massive war crimes during this time because
they were terrified.
They were terrified. They and with then all of the orders that were already coming from higher up, from the SS and from the Nazi leadership, that do what you can in order to get rid of any civilian resistance. This opened the door to tragedy. And actually, in this case, kind of tragedy on both sides, because it escalated one thing to another. Yeah. So you have a lot of prisoners of war on the German side being murdered by civilians, even if they've given up, and so on and so on. So it was a nasty campaign that followed out of Student's failure to do something sensible.
And Freiburg.
Yeah, so you mentioned, I mean, we just talked about how disastrous the German air landings were on Crete.
Yeah.
And then you also talked about Bernhard Freiberg.
Yeah.
And that he, against established intelligence,
he
believed on a naval landing was imminent. Can you expand a bit? What else might he have done better?
Sure. I see where you're going. Well, first I want to say Freiberg was a very competent military leader. We saw that later in North Africa. He was really great at set piece battles, at organizing set piece battles. Like in the second Battle of El Alamein, the New Zealanders, they were the New Zealanders. Having said that, he dropped the ball on Crete. There's no way around it. I can't say what any other general would have done, because again, that's counterfactual. But even had he initially disbelieved the intelligence that there was going to be a massive airdrop, said, no, they're coming by sea. When they didn't, even after 2 days, he had still not redeployed fully. And he still did not send troops to defend the airfield. And once the Germans had control of an airfield, it was eventually going to be in their favor, because they could bring in people faster than the British. They had more troops in the region. They had more planes. So that was a failure. I can't really say the failure of the whole operation goes at his feet, because that's not really fair. Somebody else might have done a worse job, But that was a black mark against an otherwise solid career.
And it's actually quite remarkable in this case, because you've got two commanding officers who both perform very poorly at the end of the day, or their plans don't pan out, and the Germans still win the day. Yeah. So, that kind of tells you a little bit how catastrophic this disbelief in the intelligence was.
It was the same dynamic we saw. We saw things like that happen in Norway as well.
Yeah, true.
When things, when so far in the war in 1941, when there have been events where both sides perform poorly, the Germans win the day still. That's just the way. So far, that's the way it's gone.
It might change.
It might change.
Who knows?
No spoilers here, guys.
Yeah.
I think that wraps us up for today.
Okay, that was fun.
Unless there's something else you guys wanna, because from my side, I've all the questions I wanted to ask, I have asked.
Okay, so that is it for today about Yugoslavia, Crete, and Greece. And so from me, Danny Zuko.
And from me, Kaneki.
And from me, Rizzo.
And Sandy behind the camera.
Sandy behind the camera over there. Hey, insert a picture of Clara. Okay. Just so you realize, the TimeGhost Army, we are hopelessly devoted to you. Okay? And we'll see you next time. Excelsior!